On June 20th, 1985, just after sunrise, James Telb, the sheriff of Lucas County, stepped in front of a pool of reporters that had assembled in an overgrown field in Spencer Township, a small enclave outside of Toledo, Ohio. Sheriff Telb announced, rather bluntly, that his department had uncovered a large satanic cult of over 200 people that had been active in the area for over 16 years. The cult took drugs, mutilated animals, and sacrificed humans, most of them children and infants. These sacrifices took place at least 5 times a year on high satanic holidays, and the bodies of those ritually murdered, 50 to 60 of them, were buried in the very field in which they stood, right under their feet. In recent years, news media has begun to reevaluate and deconstruct the Satanic Panic, a bout of mass hysteria that afflicted the United States for over a decade. But what if it wasn't just hysteria? What if some of it was true? Ritual Rewind brings you into the darkest corners of the 1980s, uncovering the crimes, conspiracies, and occult fears that shaped a generation. Tonight, we delve into the emergence of a satanic cult in rural Ohio. It's a tale of child kidnapping, police overreach, and good intentions gone bad. It's the case of the devil and the false prophet, and I'm your host, Drew, and you're listening to The Ritual Rewind. Prior to Sheriff Telb's announcement of a satanic cult in the area, the community was already primed to believe. 10 days prior, the city of Akron, Ohio, 150 miles away, had just had a community meeting to discuss the animal mutilations that had taken place in their city. In Union County, only 100 miles away, someone had been killing and mutilating dozens of household pets, including dogs, cats, and chickens. And when the slayings were marked on a map, they connected to form a pentagram. In nearby Swanson, Ohio, only 10 miles away, a Methodist church had been vandalized. The minister found stained glass windows broken, strange occult symbols etched on the altar, and a baby doll with its dress pulled up over its head. Sheriff Telb, who was 42 at the time and who had only recently been elected sheriff, had this on his mind when he stood in front of the reporters. Little did he know the profound and irreversible effects a pronouncement like this would have on his small, rural community. But at the time, that wasn't a concern for the sheriff. He told the press that he would be executing a search warrant on the premises and would be digging up the bodies of the suspected victims, one of which he believed to be Charity Freeman. Charity Freeman would have been 9 years old at the time of Telb's announcement. She had been kidnapped by her grandfather Leroy Freeman 2.5 years prior, when she was just 7 years old, and she had not been seen since. Her abduction still lingered over the small community like a black cloud that only got darker when Sheriff Telb alerted the press that Leroy Freeman held the position of high warlock within the suspected cult and had sacrificed his own granddaughter to Satan. A few hours before the sheriff's announcement, Sheriff Telb had authorized a raid on the nearby home of Alvin and Patricia Litton. A confidential informant had spotted someone she believed to be Leroy Freeman entering and exiting the home. So in the black of night, just before dawn, 20 sheriff deputies burst through the front door of the residence as the Littons and their 5 children slept. Neither Leroy nor his granddaughter Charity were discovered there. However, the deputies did find and confiscated an Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom poster, 2 Ozzy Osbourne albums, and a couple blank cassette discs. Alvin and Patricia Litton were eventually released from custody after several hours of vigorous questioning. The sheriff stated that the dig was the culmination of a months-long investigation, which had been prompted when a woman, only identified to the public as Mrs. Jones, had contacted a Lieutenant Kirk Surprise at the sheriff's department. She alerted the lieutenant to cult activity in the area that she believed had connections to missing and murdered children. Mrs. Jones revealed to the lieutenant that she had a friend who had just recently joined her church. The friend, who was to become a confidential informant for the police, had previously been a member of a cult after having been introduced to it by her father-in-law while living in Texas. When the informant was asked the name of the cult, she couldn't remember, but she had been able to show Mrs. Jones the site where the satanic rituals had occurred, which was the field in which everyone stood and was the home of 2 abandoned residences. The informant said that before moving into the abandoned homes, the cult operated out of a funeral home and used the bodies of the recently deceased for their ritual practices. The informant further explained that she had witnessed and participated in numerous horrible acts, including the kidnapping and murdering of children. Lieutenant Surprise asked if the high warlock, who to him was Leroy Freeman, was required to donate his own child to the cult. The informant replied with the biblical tale of Abraham and Isaac, in which God demanded Abraham sacrifice his son, and Abraham obeyed. When asked by Lieutenant Surprise when she had last attended a ritual, the informant said sometime in March, when she had gone with her husband to visit Lady Circe. Lady Circe was a registered nurse who worked in a hospital in Toledo and operated a storefront for witches, and has stated that she knew that she was a witch from the age of 12, but denied being the leader of a cult. The informant said that those initiated into the cult would go to the temple, which was hidden underground and could only be accessed through Lady Circe's store. Inside the temple, displayed prominently on the altar, was an inverted cross with Jesus hanging upside down. And during the initiation, each new member would kiss the ass of a statue of Satan. And then the initiant would move on to the next station, which was an oval-shaped mirror. When they gazed into this mirror, the other members of the cult would be able to determine whether the initiate was worthy. According to the informant, if the person's reflection in the mirror showed darkening around the eyes and hollowed out cheeks, they would be accepted. If not, they were sent away. If accepted, the initiate would strip nude and offer themselves up to the High Warlock for a sexual gratification. The informant told Lieutenant Surprise that the man that currently lived on the property where the occult practices took place was a black man named Willie. Willie lived at the end of Melky Road near Bemis Lane. The mention of Bemis Lane piqued the lieutenant's interest because the skeletal remains of a young woman were discovered there 10 years before. Judith Ann Petrie was a 20-year-old babysitter from Oregon, Ohio, and she had last been seen leaving a home in East Toledo. That same year, a teenage boy discovered her skeleton in a field at the end of Bemis Lane. The coroner said her skull had long slit marks, likely inflicted by a machete, and her murder had remained unsolved. The informant then relayed the story of a young woman that was sacrificed around the same time. The woman was in a drug-induced state when the cult member sexually assaulted her and suffocated her to death. Lieutenant Surprise surmised that the woman sacrificed by the cult and the skeletal remains found at the end of Bemis Lane must be one and the same. The cult had murdered Judith Petrie and dumped her body. Lieutenant Surprise wanted the informant to show him the location of where the bodies were buried, and she agreed. They drove to Bemis Lane, and on the ride there, the lieutenant showed the informant a photo of Charity Freeman and asked if she had ever seen the girl. The informant hesitated before stating that she had not. He then showed her a picture of Leroy Freeman, and again, the informant said she had never seen him before. Lieutenant Surprise was sure that she had just lied to him. When they arrived at Bemis Lane, the informant indicated the spot where two girls had been buried. She stated that each victim's grave was marked by a stake with a goat's head impaled upon it. However, at that time, neither the stakes nor the remnants of the goat heads could be found. The informant soon became uneasy and agitated. She told the lieutenant that Willie often roamed this area and was always heavily armed, so they left. But before Surprise ended the meeting, he asked the informant when the next cult meeting was scheduled to take place. She said it would be in a few days on April 20th. Lieutenant Surprise recruited Deputy Trilby Cashin to assist in the investigation. Deputy Cashin was the department's photographer and spent most of her time in a dark room in the department's basement, and she was eager to get out. Lieutenant Surprise had Deputy Cashin gather up her photography equipment, and they returned to Bemis Lane. There, Surprise had Cashin pretend to be a model while he took photographs of the locations where the satanic activities had supposedly taken place. While in the process of documenting the scene, a blue Chevy Chevette turned onto Bemis Lane and parked. No one exited the vehicle. When Lieutenant Surprise started towards the car, the Chevette drove off. Deputy Cashin was able to catch a look at the driver. It was a white female, meaning it wasn't Willie. Feeling uneasy, Cashin and Surprise packed up and left. Lieutenant Surprise decided that the next step was to stake out the occult homes on the next scheduled ritual on April 20th. Surprise had been warned by the informant to be on the lookout for what she called sentries. Sentries were members of the cult that patrolled the area around the site to scare off or threaten anyone that didn't belong. And on the night of April 20th, Surprise and Cashin hunkered down in a secluded spot in the woods, about 100 yards from the occult house, and they waited. They noticed several cars that appeared to drive up and down the rural road, and as they watched the house, they noted that the lights were on until around 11 p.m. when they suddenly shut off. Minutes before midnight, Surprise and Cashin heard a dog bark that abruptly ended in a yelp. And then at midnight, Surprise heard a female scream, and immediately after, a chorus of voices chanted, "More! More. The forest then became eerily quiet and nothing else happened. Surprise and Cashin left before dawn. Following their first night of surveillance, Surprise reached out to Police Captain Dale Griffiths from nearby Tiffin. Griffiths was a self-proclaimed expert on the occult and had received his degree from Columbia Pacific University in California. But it should be noted that he only took classes by mail, and the university was eventually shut down by the state of California for failure to reach basic educational requirements. But that didn't stop Griffiths. He lectured around the country on topics of mind control, cults, and satanic worship. However, his occult bona fides would be tested when he testified in the trials of the West Memphis 3 in 1994. Like many others, Lieutenant Surprise had first heard about Griffiths when he was featured in the Columbus Dispatch a year prior. In the newspaper article, Griffiths shared a story of a woman from Fairfield County, Ohio, who had joined a satanic cult when she was 11 years old. She was forced to participate in the ritual mutilation of animals and in drinking their blood. And at one point, she claimed to have witnessed the sacrifice of a baby. Surprise relayed to Griffiths the information that he had learned through the informant and from their stakeout. Griffiths agreed that these were signature signs of satanic rituals and occult practices. Griffiths offered to loan Surprise and Cashin some equipment to enhance their next stakeout. This included bionic ears and nighttime vision goggles. And with that, Surprise and Cashin ventured back into the woods. At one point in the night, both Surprise and Cashin watched 4 or 5 people carry lit torches inside the house. Then, all of a sudden, out of the shadows, a guy appeared and just stared at them. He said nothing. Frightened, Lieutenant Surprise whipped out his gun and yelled at the man, "Get out of here!" The man turned around and disappeared. Neither Surprise nor Cashin pursued. Following the second night of surveillance, Surprise and Cashin again met with the confidential informant. This time, they wanted to know who else was involved. The informant said that she had witnessed police officers at the ritual ceremonies, a Lucas County Sheriff's deputy and a Toledo police officer, though she couldn't provide the names of either one because the cult did not use real names. Lieutenant Surprise then listed off several names, and the informant agreed to some and denied others. Again, Surprise pressed her on Leroy and Charity Freeman. Surprise was desperate to connect Leroy to the cult. The informant eventually acquiesced to the pressure and agreed that Charity Freeman had been murdered by her grandfather Leroy as part of a satanic ritual and was subsequently buried on the property. After this final meeting with his informant, Surprise presented his evidence to Sheriff Telb, and together they requested a search warrant for the property. Now on the day of the dig, 3 hours had passed since the sheriff's announcement and the excavation had begun, and no human remains had been found. Prior to the dig, the sheriff had consulted archaeologist Dr. Michael Pratt. Pratt offered advice on how to search for the burial sites, stating that if the graves were present, there would be depressions in the ground. But the area was overgrown with brush. They would need a bulldozer to skim off the first layer of dirt, disturbing the depressions and corrupting the scene. Captain Dale Griffiths arrived by helicopter in the early afternoon. His appearance at the scene caused an uproar in the press. Immediately upon his arrival, Griffiths pointed out 4 possible burial sites. One was covered with wire mesh, presumably to keep scavenger animals at bay. He then moved on to the abandoned homes and invited the reporters to go with him. In the houses, Griffiths found walls riddled with bullet holes, a sign, he said, of nefarious activity. Trash littered the floors, and some of it contained cryptic writing that was possibly satanic. He found an inverted cross with an American flag tied to its base and uncovered an 8-inch dagger covered in paint, and a headless doll which had its feet nailed to a board, and a birthday card featuring the cartoon image of a red devil. All signs, Griffiths believed, pointed to cult activity. The archaeologist Pratt was also shown the dagger covered in paint. Pratt, who was trained to take in the context in which an item was found, told the investigators that it looked like the dagger was merely used as a paint stirrer. But Griffiths said it was a ritual knife and the paint was to simulate blood. Sheriff Telb went with Griffiths' assessment. At the end of a fruitless first day of searching, Telb stepped in front of the reporters and made another announcement. They were ending the search for the day and would continue the following morning. And though they had found nothing at the moment, the sheriff believed the department's appearance there at least halted the looming attempt at another sacrifice that would have coincided with the summer solstice that was to take place the following day. He added, "Some critics say you've got egg on your face. Whatever. We'll take egg on our face before blood on our hands." And when pressed by reporters, Deputy Cashin said, "I believe the bodies are out there. We just don't have the right information to find them." Bodies or not, the residents of Spencer Township were on edge, and they were scared. They had just learned of a large satanic cult that murdered children and had been operating in their community for over a decade. Watch groups formed and began patrolling their respective neighborhoods, armed with baseball bats and guns, in hopes of catching the perpetrators in the act. Fearing mob violence, the township's trustees pressed the sheriff's department for more information on the confidential informants used in this investigation. Telb, in surprise, refused to name names. But the trustees' concerns weren't unfounded. There were several instances of close calls that could have escalated to violence or death. One watch group chased down a van that they believed to be filled with Satanists, only to discover it filled with teenagers out joyriding. Another armed group surrounded a gathering of purported devil worshippers that they found in the woods, only to learn that it was the local Lutheran church hosting a service around a bonfire. For some, though, the rumors about the cult rituals and human sacrifice were too wild to be believed. They had never witnessed any of these purported activities and believed that in such a small, tight-knit community, there would be more evidence. But the authorities countered that a group of devil worshippers needed secrecy to operate, so the absence of evidence was evidence of cult activity. According to the book Digging Up the Devil, the Cult Awareness Network was formed in 1984 and became the largest anti-cult organization in the country, and it is driven by the belief that lost children are being taken by new religions. They created a model to describe the 4 levels of satanic involvement. There are the dabblers, which are teens who listen to rock music with occult themes and show interest in satanic imagery or become involved in fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. The dabblers were at risk for suicide, drug addiction, violent activity, and animal cruelty. The next level is self-styled Satanism. This level is populated by psychopathic or sociopathic criminals with dangerous and deviant behavior. The third level of Satanism is organized Satanism. This consists of people who are public Satanists and part of an organized movement, such as the Church of Satan or the Temple of Set. The fourth level is covert Satanism. This is characterized by multi-generational family involvement in a secretive, highly exclusive cult. When digging resumed on the second day, Sheriff Telb barred reporters from the scene. But even as the dig continued, the sheriff's department found nothing. No human remains, no signs of foul play, and no evidence of any crime of any kind being committed. Sheriff Telb again called off the dig for the second time and told the reporters gathered, "We may come back out in a few days, or we may never come back again." Lieutenant Surprise, who had inarguably pushed for this search, said of the matter, "I would just assume this thing will all turn out to be a big fairy tale." Sheriff Telb still considered his sources to be reliable and remained a true believer. He returned 2 weeks later on July 2nd, 1985, but did so with no announcement and no press, just a handful of deputies and a couple of bloodhounds. They again searched the area, and again, they found nothing. The residents of Spencer Township were incensed. The amount of chaos and negative national attention caused by the accusations would linger over the town like a black mark for decades to come. The township's board of trustees wanted accountability. They wanted to know the names of the confidential informants. But again, Sheriff Telb refused to name them, though Deputy Cashin would eventually admit that she was one of the informants. She had seen Leroy Freeman enter the Litton house, only to later learn that she had actually seen Patricia Litton's father and mistaken him for Freeman. So one of the township's trustees attempted his own investigation into the informant's identity and believes he found at least one of them, a man named Herman Haynes. Herman Haynes was a Bible-thumping minister from a Baptist church in Toledo, and he readily believed that Toledo was infested by satanic cults. And when the trustee realized Haynes was one of the informants, he knew they were on a ship of fools. Undisclosed to the media at the time, Haynes was the owner of the property that held both occult houses. The headless doll, the ceremonial knife, and all other items came from the buildings owned by Haynes. The sheriff's deputy came forward and stated that he believed that the so-called satanic artifacts were nothing more than the remnants of the life of a mentally ill man named Lewis Williams. Williams was a drifter who lived in the abandoned buildings on Haynes' property. Alvin and Patricia Litton eventually filed a lawsuit against the Lucas County Sheriff's Department for false arrest, harassment, and distress. After their house was raided by police, they frequently experienced threats for several years afterwards. People would drive by their house and yell, "Murderer, and we'll get you." Deputy Cashin's involvement in the case ended when her pastor called Sheriff Telb and asked for her to be removed. It had taken an enormous toll and resulted in the end of her marriage. Decades later, Sheriff Telb ultimately admitted that he had made mistakes and that he should never have called the press conference because he didn't have enough time to find out what was going on before the reporters bombarded him with questions. However, he continues to believe that the investigation served a larger purpose in raising public awareness about satanic cults. And in 1988, 3 years after the excavation, Leroy Freeman and his granddaughter Charity were discovered living in an apartment in Huntington Beach, California. Police said Charity was healthy and in good physical shape. She was not being held captive, she had not been tortured, and she had not been sacrificed. In researching this episode, we relied on the articles from the Toledo Blade and the New York Times, and the book Digging Up the Devil by Jack Legg. The sources can be found in the show notes. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Ritual Rewind. I'm looking to grow this podcast, so if you like it, please rate it and review it. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, give it a like and a comment. And as always, you can interact with us at the Ritual Rewind on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And as this is a podcast about when cassette culture met cult culture, please stay tuned for this week's movie pairing after this short break. This week's recommended film pairing is the 1990 film First Power, starring Lou Diamond Phillips as a hotshot police detective on the hunt for a serial killer known as the Pentagram Killer. Except the thing is, the detective has already caught this killer before. In fact, within the first 15 minutes of the movie, the killer has been caught, tried, convicted, and executed. But it seems that the Pentagram Killer has been resurrected from the dead and given the first power, and now inhabits the body of his victims before killing them. This is a fantastical film, but the most unbelievable part of the film may be that this 28-year-old baby-faced detective has caught 5 serial killers in what has to be a very short but illustrious career. I will give this film 3 VHS tapes out of 5. Have a good night, and see you next week.